Good morning, everybody, and welcome to 10-Minute Wellbeing Tips for Managers. If you've joined us before, there have been times where I've shared something about myself, but I'm not sure if I've ever shared that I like to bike ride. Now, I've been biking since I was a kid. I prefer to keep my two wheels on the ground, though. And even though I don't do this kind of biking, I have done some things that maybe aren't too smart on my bike. One of them was about 20 years ago. No, 15 years ago, excuse me. My daughter was just about one. She was still in diapers and in a crib, and she's the youngest of three. I wanted to get a bike ride in before I went to work, which meant leaving the house around 5 a.m. And it wasn't summertime, so it was dark. And there I am biking around thinking I'm helping my health and well-being, and I hit a speed bump. Needless to say, the speed bump worked and I ended up on the ground. When we think of our well-being, we often think about things that we can add into our day, like more fruits and vegetables or more gratitude. Sometimes we need to remove things to help our well-being, like removing speed bumps. So today, I just want to share a few thoughts about barriers to well-being. Now, if you're on a clinical unit, you probably on your feet most of the day, and there's probably times you want to just sit down, go into the break room and take a break off of your feet. Well, you walk in and it's probably not uncommon to see donuts or cake or cookies, and that might be okay and good for some people's well-being. But if you're trying to avoid sugar because you either are at risk for diabetes or have diabetes, or trying to avoid salt because you have high blood pressure, then your barrier to well-being is the temptation of these beautiful donuts. I mean, who wouldn't want to eat one? Now, let's say that you're not in a clinical unit and you're just the opposite. Instead of wanting to sit down, you're always sitting and you want a break to get up and walk. But your barrier is that your job is tied to your computer and your desk. Let's go back to our friends on the clinical units, and perhaps you're always surrounded by people and maybe you just need to get away and the break room has people in it. You just need some peace and quiet. Your barrier might be trying to find that place where you can be alone. Now, this is not ideal because obviously people can walk by in a hallway and it's going to be difficult to not only get privacy, but some quiet. And for other people, they need a place to have a private call with someone at home. Perhaps there's something challenging going on in your life afterwards. There are lots of different barriers. I'm not going to be able to cover them all today, obviously, but perhaps this is a wake up for all of us to think about having that conversation with our team to discover what barriers exist and brainstorming to how to find solutions to remove those barriers. Time is often a barrier to well-being. So sometimes the time barrier is not being able to get to a Healthy at Hopkins program at a certain day and time. Other times it might be, hey, I can't get on the portal, but it doesn't have to be so prescriptive. Even just the barrier of time, like wanting to get out of a meeting on time or getting out of work on time because there's a child to pick up. Time can be is a very common barrier. Our well-being isn't always about healthy habits that we're trying to build or maintain. Sometimes our well-being is about coming up against a wall at work. There's a barrier for us to do our jobs. Johns Hopkins Medicine uses a Glint survey to measure the opinions of our employees on many fronts, including well-being. We used to use a Gallup survey, and one of the questions that we had was, do I have the materials and equipment I need to do my job? Well, we often didn't score well on this question. Not having the materials and the equipment to do one's job can be frustrating and a barrier to our well-being. So one thing that you might try is to create a list of opportunities. I could say barriers, I could say opportunities. opportunities to remove barriers. So this week, I was on the Johns Hopkins Hospital lead meeting. That's for managers and other leaders. And an example came up about patient transport, that there's some frustration around gurneys arriving to transport patients that don't have a place to hold the oxygen tank for those patients who are needing oxygen during their transport. So there's something that's frustrating, and that they are coming to a solution to remove that barrier. Sometimes we have to look long and hard in the mirror to find a barrier to well-being for our team. Sometimes we are the barrier for our team's well-being. Perhaps we're not having a good day, and as a result, we're not smiling, we're speaking in short and curt sentences, and perhaps the barrier for the people on our team, the barrier for their well-being is being around someone like me on a day that I'm a bit stressed. Perhaps the barrier is not even happening during the workday. Perhaps one of us is sending emails either before work or after work, making the people on our team feel like they should be checking their emails off hours. And so I have a couple of tips. One I already discussed kind of on a couple of slides earlier, and that's about having a discussion with your team about what barriers might be in their way for well-being. I'll tell you, there was an IT leader at Johns Hopkins Healthcare who joined Johns Hopkins Medicine many years ago. And when he came here, he was an avid runner, and he continued to run. Fortunately for him, there was a shower at his campus, so he didn't have a barrier to running and then getting cleaned up and returning to work after his lunch break. But he noticed that many people on his teams were always tied to their desk. Their IT people. Makes sense. So one way to remove the barrier to movement for him was to have his one-on-one meetings with the people on his team by walking. So a manager tip for you is to think about what's getting in the way of your well-being. Are you too tired to when you get home, to stick to your efforts to make healthy dinners? Is fatigue your barrier? If so, maybe there's some meal prep that can be done on the weekend. Is someone else your barrier to well-being? Is your own manager your well-being, or somebody in the workplace or someone in your home life a barrier to your well-being? And if so, is there a way for you to address that relationship in your life? Now, we can't control everything. We're not going to be able to remove every barrier. If you've attended 10-minute well-being tips for managers in the past, you probably thought this was close to the end. Surprise, surprise. So when we can't remove a barrier, we need to think, or I suggest or invite us to think about flexibility. Flexibility allows us to adjust to a barrier and allows us to not have that barrier cause us additional harm to our well-being. In other words, if we're having a hard time on our well-being journey because there's a barrier, and if we can't remove that barrier and we allow that barrier to affect our emotions, then that barrier is causing more than one impact on your well-being. Flexibility is a well-being strategy, and I use this flexibility strategy in the last 24 hours. Our colleague, Carolyn, informed me yesterday morning that she wasn't going to be able to get to work. And so she asked me if I would do today's 10-minute well-being tip. So my barrier to well-being was time yesterday, because I needed to add this into my schedule. And I decided I was just going to do as best as I could. And my colleagues today would be forgiving if I either went over 10 minutes or otherwise messed up. Next week, on Monday is July 4th. I hope everybody enjoys the holiday and it brings some well-being to you. As such, with holidays that cause us to have a shorter week, we tend to forego programming on some of those days. So we will not be meeting for 10-minute well-being tips on next Thursday. We hope you'll join us on July 11th, maybe? No, can't be. Someone will figure out the date, but 2 weeks from today. I will end it there, 30 seconds overtime, and I will stop sharing.